Hello again, this is Alexia. This following video will be about my reading reports after reading chapter 9 until chapter 15 of The Catcher in the Rye. I hope you enjoy it. Chapter 9 begins when Alden arrives at Penn Station. He wants to call someone, but he doesn't know who. He hesitates with his brother D.B., who is in Hollywood, or his sister Phoebe, a younger sister. And then he thinks about Jane Gallagher and Sally Hayes, and even her mothers. Then after, he decides not to call anybody and goes to Edmond Hotel by cab. Then in the cab, he tries to make conversation with the driver and even asks about the docks. The docks, by summertime, they are in Central Park Lagoon, but in the winter they disappear. That is why he asked the driver if the driver knows where did the docks go. But the driver is confused and is uninterested. Then he arrives at the hotel. He checks in and got a room, but the room that he got was a little crumby, as he says. Then from his room, on the window, he can see through everyone else's room. Like, for example, in the room in front of him, there was one man who dresses in women's clothing. And in another room, there were a man and a woman who take turns spiting mouthfuls of their drinks into each other's faces. Holden wasn't really fond of that scene. Then he got bored. Then he calls Faith Cavendish, a promiscuous girl, like not to say she's a prostitute, that he met by the intermediary of someone from Princeton. He wanted to have a date with her late that night, but she refuses because she needs to take care of her friend. Then Holden got bored again, then hangs up the phone without arranging any meeting. In the beginning of chapter 10, it was already late at night, but Holden was feeling restless. So he decided to go downstairs in the Edmonds nightclub, which is called Lavender Room. But before going downstairs, he wanted to change his shirt. And then after changing, he was thinking about his little sister, Phoebe. He describes her as remarkably similar to his late brother Ali, because she has red hair and she's really intelligent like Ali. He describes her too like a little girl who loves movies because he always takes her to see movies and she already knows how to play them before the movie plays itself. And also, he states that Phoebe likes to write fictional stories that she never finishes. Then, after remembering his little sister, he goes downstairs in the lavender room. There, he decides to take a cocktail. He wants to drink alcohol, but the bartender knows that he's a minor, so he just takes a Coke. During the night, he meets 3 girls with whom he dances all night. He dances with them one by one, even if he doesn't find them really attractive. But he wants to dance until he is tired. But then the club has to close down and the band already stopped to play, but Holden still feels not already going to sleep, but they had to leave the club. Then before leaving, he had to pay for the girls' drinks just by being polite because he danced with them, and they couldn't stay because tomorrow morning they had some plans. Chapter 11. As he walks out the lobby, Holden reminisces about Jane Gallagher. He reminisces about the fact that their families' summer homes were next door to each other, and that's how they met. Jane Gallagher had a Doberman Pinscher who used to relieve himself in the Caulfield's garden. That is how Holden and Jane talked to each other and became close. Jane was the only person to whom Holden ever showed Ali's baseball glove. One day, Jane's alcoholic stepfather came out to the porch where Holden and Jane were playing checkers and asked Jane for cigarettes. Jane refused to answer him, and when he left, she began to cry. Holden held her, kissing her face and comforting her. Apart from that incident, Holden and Jane's relationship was mild, but they used to hold hands constantly. Holden states that while he was holding Jane's hand, he was happy. He really was happy. Though after remembering that memory, Holden feels upset, so he returns to his room. He notices that the lights in the pervert's room are out. He calls pervert those person next door to him, which he was stalking earlier. Then he's still wide awake, so he heads downstairs again and grabs a taxi. Chapter 12. Holden takes a cab to a Greenwich Village nightclub called Ernie's, a spot that he used to frequent with his brother D.B. His cab driver is named Horvitz, and Holden takes a liking to him. But when Holden tries to ask him about the docks again, the docks in the Central Park Lagoon, the taxi driver becomes angry, so Holden leaves it. Then he arrives at Ernie's. He listens to Ernie playing the piano, but is unimpressed by the play. So he waits for himself to get a table, and then got the table, and drinks scotch and soda with it. Then he starts listening to the conversations around him, which is specified as depressing and funny. Then he meets a girl named Lillian Simmons, a girl with whom his brother DB used to date. He didn't want to join her, so he was forced to leave the nightclub just to get away from her. Chapter 13. As he was leaving Ernie's, Holden decides to go back to his hotel, but this time he doesn't take the cab. He decides to walk through the night, but it was cold. Then he didn't have gloves. That is when he remembers his gloves that were stolen at Pensy. He imagined how he caught the people who stole it and how he would be a coward towards that person, because Holden is not a really violent person. He states that he will simply take the gloves if he knows who got it. Later, he arrives at the hotel. As he was taking the elevator, the operator offers him a prostitute for $5. Holden was still feeling not sleepy yet, so he said yes and decides to wait in his room for the girl. Then later, she arrives. Her name is Sonny, and Holden describes her as a cynical young girl with a high voice. Then Holden becomes flustered as when she removes her green dress. He's flustered because he seems to be a really experienced boy. However, he's still a virgin. That is why he's flustered. And as he gets nervous, mostly when Sonny tries to seduce him, then he decides that he does not want to have sex with her, but although he pays her $5. But then Sonny claims that the price is 10, but Holden refuses to pay her more. Then Sonny leaves with all of her stuff. Chapter 14. Holden sits in his hotel room and smokes for a while. He remembers an incident shortly before Ali's death when he excluded Ali from a BB gun game. He still feels guilty for having left Ali out. Eventually, he goes to bed. He feels like praying, but his distaste for organized religion prevents him from following through on his inclination. Suddenly, there's a knock at his door. In his pajamas, Holden opens the door to face Maurice, the birdie elevator operator, who has returned with Sonny to collect the extra $5 Sonny demanded. Holden tries to refuse, but Maurice pins him against the wall while Sonny takes the money from his wallet. Maurice snaps his finger into Holden's groin, and Holden starts to insult him in response. Maurice slugs Holden in the stomach and leaves him on the floor. Holden imagines himself as a movie character taking his revenge on Maurice after having been plugged in the gut with a gangster's bullet. But finally, he manages to get into bed and go to sleep. Chapter 15. The next morning, Holden calls Sally Hayes and makes a date with her for later that afternoon. Then he checks out of the hotel and leaves his bag in a locker at Grand Central Station. He worries about losing his money and mentions that his father frequently gets hungry when Holden loses things. He also describes his mother a bit unhealthy, especially since his brother died. Also, Holden worries that the news of his expulsion will particularly distress his fragile mother, from whom he seems to care a great. After that, Holden goes to eat breakfast at a little sandwich bar, where he meets two nuns who are moving to Manhattan to teach in a school. Holden thinks about the superficial money-driven world of the prep school he has just left. Then he talks to one of the nuns about Romeo and Juliet. Despite his earlier expression of distaste for organized religion, he forces them to take $10 as a charitable contribution. After they leave, although he realizes he needs money to pay for his date with Sally, he begins to regret having given only $10. He concludes that money always makes people depressed.